Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Terry Sewell. I proudly represent Alabama's 7th Congressional District, which includes the historic cities of Birmingham, Montgomery, and my hometown of Selma, Alabama. I'm honored to be joined by House Democratic leadership, as well as members of the Tri-Caucus, as we draw attention to the need for federal legislation to protect voting rights. It was 11 years ago when the Supreme Court's conservative majority gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, eliminating voter protections and removing federal oversight from states with a proven track record of voter discrimination. The consequences of the Shelby decision have been clear and devastating. Long lines at the polling stations, strict ID requirements, closed polling stations in communities of color without notice, bans on early voting and absentee voting, and purging of voter rolls. The list goes on and on. Since the Shelby decision, we have seen 31 states institute at least 103 new laws to restrict voting access. And it is no surprise that those laws disproportionately target Black and minority voters. In my home state of Alabama, lawmakers have made it a felon to assist someone with an absentee ballot. These laws may not be new. They are not new. They are part of a borrowed old playbook, and they're having devastating effects on African American communities and minority voters all across America. While Black voters may not need to count the number of jelly beans in a jar, modern-day barriers to voting are just as pernicious as the poll tax and literacy test of the past. In the Shelby decision, the Supreme Court was clear that the onus was on Congress to come up with a modern-day formula to determine which states should be subject to federal oversight. While I'm proud to say that we have done just that, and we've called it after our beloved former colleague, John Lewis. Working together with our nation's premier civil rights and voting rights organizations, we've come up with a modern-day formula to ensure states and localities with a recent history of voter discrimination are prohibited from restricting voting access. We even named it after our former colleague, John Lewis. The John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which we introduced for the 5th time in September, would protect the right of every American to vote. But despite our efforts, our colleagues across the aisles have continued to block us from even considering the bill. The fact that the Voting Rights Act has become a partisan issue is frankly baffling to me. You see, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been reauthorized 5 times since 1965, and 3 times under Republican presidents. Most recently, in 2006, George W. Bush signed the Voting Rights Reauthorization Act. Yet instead of working with us to restore its protections, our Republican colleagues have instead chosen to spread disinformation and sow seeds of doubt about the integrity of our elections. We as elected officials should be working to ensure that all Americans are able to vote, instead of picking and choosing those who will have access to the ballot box. You see, this fight is very personal to me. I grew up in Selma, Alabama, and representing that historic city and what happened on that bridge over almost 60 years ago is very personal to me. We know that John Lewis was bludgeoned on a bridge for the equal right of all Americans to vote. We also know that it'll be 60 years next year. 60 years after those foot soldiers were bludgeoned on the bridge, their cause has become our cause too. Who would have ever thought that progress would be so backwards, that we would be having the same fight that they had 60 years ago? You know, it was 60 years ago that they prayed, they protested, they bled, and some even died for the right to vote. It was their sacrifices that gave us the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I dare say that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, along with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, are crown jewels of the civil rights and voting rights movement. Those foot soldiers were ordinary Americans who had the audacity to make this nation live up to its highest ideals of equality and justice for all. Their legacy of courage and sacrifice, is what we stand on today. Never did I think that the cause for which they sacrifice would become our cause. It goes to show that progress is elusive, and every generation must hold on to the progress of the past and try to work to advance it. Our vote is our voice, and our democracy is strongest when every American is able to make their voices heard at the ballot box. We're not asking anyone to put their lives on the line. We're simply asking that our Republican colleagues have the political courage to do what is right. I want to thank my colleagues for joining me today, and I am honored to introduce our Democratic whip, Catherine Clark.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you to my friend, the suffragist from Selma, Terry Sewell, and to all my colleagues and leaders here with me today and across our Democratic caucus for taking up the banner that the great John Lewis carried for so long, the cause that so many have bled for and died for, the principle that nothing is more sacred or foundational to a democracy than equal access to the ballot box. When a 23-year-old John Lewis joined the March on Washington, he declared to the hundreds of thousands of people gathered on the National Mall, "How long can we be patient? We want our freedom and we want it now." That impatience propelled a generation of Americans to make good on long broken promises, to secure the Voting Rights Act, and to swing open the door of polling places across this country. But as Congresswoman Sewell set forth, 6 decades later, the fight to preserve, protect, and defend our democracy is still raging. The sanctity of the vote is still under siege. And as we gather to mark 11 long years since Shelby v. Holder, we still face the same enemy, extremists who think that voting should be a privilege and not a right, who believe that the polling place should be invite only. The extremism that spurred the big lie fueled an insurrection on our Capitol. It's the same ideology that motivated the Shelby decision and the flood of anti-voter bills that followed. This is a battle over the fundamental nature of our country. Will we be a nation rooted in freedom or extremism? Will we enact the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act? Or will we keep sliding back into the government for a few? House Democrats are proud to stand on the side of democracy, on the side of the American people, and on the right side of history. We will not allow the legacy of those freedom fighters to go undefended. We will channel their impatience, and we will not rest until the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is the law of the land. And that is thanks in no small part to the leadership of our chairman, Pete Aguilar.
Thank you so much, Whip Clark, and to Representative Sewell for your leadership and for bringing us all together to honor the legacy of our late great friend, John Lewis. We know that the fight for voting rights is as urgent as ever. In the 11 years since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, Republican extremists have only ramped up their attacks on our democracy. States across the country have repeatedly undermined our democratic process by deliberately passing hundreds of voter suppression laws across our communities that make it harder to vote, especially for communities of color, including Latinos. The bottom line is that House Democrats believe that every citizen, regardless of where they live, what their zip code is, or what their background is, deserves the right to vote without fear or discrimination. Heroes like John Lewis risked their lives for the basic ideas, and their memory reminds us that the right to vote is the most powerful, nonviolent tool that we have to keep democracy alive. So today, House Democrats recommit ourselves to making sure that every single American has equal access to the ballot box by passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Not only does this bill work to protect the sacred right to vote, but it restores the critical protections from the Voting Rights Act that block discriminatory anti-voter laws from going into effect. Voting rights should not be a partisan issue, as Representative Sewell said. All we need now is a few Republicans who believe in democracy and who believe in the promise of America to join us. With that, I'll yield back to Terry Sewell.
Person who needs no introduction, none other than Congressman Jim Clyburn.
Thank you very much, Terry. I was thinking a couple of days ago, I heard a reporter ask or say to someone, thank you so much for the favor of your time. And I thought about that word favor as opposed to freedom. The fact of the matter is, what we seem to be getting from our friends on the other side of the aisle are a lot of favors and very little freedom. I can remember when my parents first got the right to cast an effective vote. It may sound strange. I remember that. Because up until I was 8 years old, in South Carolina, the Democratic primary was a white-only private club, which meant that the majority of the citizens of that state could not cast an effective vote. You were free to vote in the general election, but the only meaningful election at that time was the Democratic primary. And so you can imagine what it was like in my household when my parents first got the right to vote. We thought that it was a battle that once won will never be lost. But what happened after the institution of Jim Crow, a lot of creative devices came online that made the vote ineffective for those who were people of color. And what we see today is a repetition of those creative devices. How do you make it felonious to assist someone with a ballot? It is beyond me that our colleagues cannot see the fallacy in that and what a threat that is to the freedoms that we hold dear. There's nothing more fundamental to the freedoms of a democracy than the right to cast a fair, unfettered, effective vote. I also remember when I first met John Lewis. We were 19-year-old college students fighting, as he would often say, to get off the back of the bus into voting lines, into voting precincts, and to become full-fledged citizens in this great society. But as it happened, 13 years after the Civil War, what has happened today is very reminiscent of us using creative devices to make the vote ineffective, if at all. This bill is designed to do exactly what the United States Supreme Court says we should do, and that is bring forth formula by which we can create a voting rights law that will be fair and effective. We've done exactly what the Supreme Court asked us to do, and we've introduced that bill now, this time for the 5th time. 3 times it's been filibustered in the House, 1 time filibustered in the Senate, and 1 time it died in the House. This is the 5th time attempting to do what the Supreme Court said should be done, but our colleagues on the other side of the aisle see it differently. I would hope that with the introduction of this bill, that they will find it within themselves to allow a vote on the floor of the House. Beyond asking anybody to vote for it, just put it on the floor so that we can cast a fair, unfettered, effective vote. And we'd be glad, unlike the other side, we'd be glad to live by the results. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Our Assistant Leader, Joe Neguse.
Thank you, Congresswoman Sewell. It is impossible to follow Mr. Clyburn, but I will certainly try. But one of the privileges that we have in the United States Congress is serving with living legends, with true giants, not all members, mind you, but some true giants. And Mr. Clyburn is one of those giants, a living legend, an icon, a hero, who spoke eloquently, as you just heard, about his parents' journey and struggle against segregation, who spoke eloquently about his friend and our dear colleague, the late John Lewis, and his struggle in the civil rights movement. But what you did not hear Mr. Clyburn talk about or discuss was his own work as a young man growing up in the segregated South in a small town in South Carolina, protesting and marching for civil rights, jailed as a young man where he met his future wife, and the work that he did to ultimately ensure that folks like myself and Representative Sewell and Chairman Aguilar, so many others, would even have the opportunity to serve in this distinguished body. So we're grateful to Mr. Clyburn for his legacy of service to our country and for continuing the clarion call to make the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act a reality. We're also deeply grateful to Congresswoman Sewell, who has been a fierce champion for getting this done since the first day that she arrived here on Capitol Hill. It has been a long journey, and there is more road for us to traverse. But I am confident with Representative Sewell's leadership and the incredible leaders here at the podium and in our House Democratic Caucus that we will ultimately get this bill one day signed into law. We talked about heroes. Of course, one of those heroes is Mr. Lewis. And one of my favorite quotes, of course, there's many quotes of his that I know sustain many of us, but one of my favorite quotes is when he once said that the vote is the most powerful, non-violent tool that we have. And I am reminded of that this week as we mark the 11-year anniversary of the disastrous Shelby decision and the work that must be done to protect that sacrosanct tool for every single American. The key to doing that is passing this bill that Representative Sewell has implored the Congress to take up. And we will continue to support her in her efforts every step of the way.
And from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, its Deputy Chair, Adriana Aspiat.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you, Congressman Clyburn and leadership of our House here, of our caucus. One person, one vote. What is it that folks find so dangerous in the concept, in the fundamental concept of one person, one vote? Is it that it includes women? Is it that they find offensive and dangerous? Is it that it includes African Americans that unshackle themselves so they can get to that poll site? Is it that they include Latinos, one person, una persona, un voto? What is it that they find so offensive about that important concept of our democracy, of our nation, of the world, that they have to resort to the treachery of politics to introduce in 31 states 103 restrictive voting laws that hinders folks' ability to exercise that one person, one vote right, deeply rooted in the center of democracy across the world, really. This is not an American concept. This is part of humanity. And so what is it that some folks find so offensive that we have to introduce the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act for the 5th time? Is it a threat to democracy? Is it a threat to law and order, to peace? So we stand here today as we mark the 11th anniversary of Shelby County versus Holder. And we stand here to remember that we will continue the struggle, the fight of the late and great John Lewis. Now, I had the opportunity to briefly meet him just several years ago, just before he passed. What an honor. And so we're here to double down on good trouble and say that we will continue the fight until we protect the sacred concept of one person, one vote.
Well, thank you. You know, in closing, I'm reminded that John led a pilgrimage of bipartisan members of Congress year after year after year to Selma, Alabama, to cross that bridge, as he would say, one more time. And over the course of those years, we've seen Republican leadership there. We've seen Democratic leadership there. We've seen members there. And I just want to employ, if you really want to do something to honor John Lewis's legacy, there is no greater thing than you can do than to restore the full protections of a bill that was a seminal piece of legislation that came out of the 60s. Under a seminal concept, every American should have the equal right, the equal access to the ballot box. And that is exactly what restoring the Voting Rights Act will do. Now, Supreme Court told Congress we had to have a new modern day formula. Well, we've done that. And there are still states that have substantial histories of voter discrimination. We still need federal oversight when states go amok. And in conclusion, I just want to remind everybody of what John said the last time he was on that bridge, riddled with cancer. But he stood tall and he said, never give up, never give in, keep your eyes on the prize. We in the Democratic caucus will keep our eyes on the prize. And yes, I've introduced it for the 5th time, but God willing and my constituents voting for me will continue to introduce it until it passes. The time is ripe to always do what's right, and it's right for us to pass the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. With that, I'll open it up for questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Congresswoman. There have been several ballot initiatives for this upcoming election in Ohio, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, all across the country to restore some of these protections that you've spoken about at the state level. Do you think that that's a worthwhile pursuit as you all work to restore federal protections?
Absolutely. Without federal oversight, all we have are state legislatures and state electorates to actually impose voter laws. And so I think that those ballot initiatives are a great way to amplify the need to restore federal oversight, to restore the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Act. And so I personally think that those ballot initiatives are really critically important, because what you're having is ordinary Americans rising up and demanding the right to vote, demanding that there not be restrictive voting. You know, it's really interesting. My interns asked me, well, it's not really hard to vote, is it? And the reality is that when states choose what kinds of IDs are valid and can be shown in order to get a ballot, they're picking winners and losers. When the state of Alabama eliminated being able to show your power bill to prove where you live and who you were, when the states across this nation eliminated a validly issued federal ID called a Social Security card, which, oh, by the way, was one of the things that you could show in Alabama, and instead impose hunting licenses, you're picking winners and losers. When you know that there are folks who need assistance, the elderly, the disabled, to fill out their absentee ballots, and you make that a crime, you're making it harder to vote. So I support all initiatives to fight for equal access to the ballot box. Yes, ma'am.
Councilman, members, what is it about now that you think it stands in more of a chance? It's the 5th time. And talking about anniversaries, which are the Freedom Summer,
Yeah.
the Civil Rights Act, 60 years. Will those in any way play a role in at least getting more attention and more action and more motivation to get anything passed this year?
Well, I'm going to let the second part, Mr. Clyburn answer, but as to the first, we've passed the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act twice out of the House. Unfortunately, it was because of Democratic votes, and it was when we had the House. But as Mr. Clyburn so eloquently said, it went over to the Senate, and we know that the Senate requires 60 votes in order to put a bill on the floor. I venture to guess that if we had 60 votes over in the Senate today, that to put the bill on the floor, that we would have 51 votes to pass it. That archaic rule, I know I've heard him speak so eloquently about it, but you're right that we're on an anniversary of Freedom Summers, and Mr. Clyburn, would you answer what kind of role does activism, grassroots activism, play in getting this across the finish line?
Well, thank you very much. Activism is what it's all about. The fact of the matter, this is the 60th year of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and as Terry mentioned earlier, we will be going to Selma. It's our plan to go to Selma next March, and it will be the 60th anniversary that we'll be celebrating in 1965. The Voting Rights Act, you may recall, at least from your studies, I'm probably the only one up here old enough to remember, that when when Congress passed in 1964, Civil Rights Act, President Johnson made it clear that that was it for a while, that nothing else could be done for a while. But that act was stripped of voting, it was stripped of housing. A lot of things that we thought were necessary got stripped out of 1964. In fact, the 64 Civil Rights Act didn't even apply to the public sector. It only applied to the private sector, the employment discrimination part of it. We didn't think that was good enough. I was there with John Lewis and others, and we activated folks all across the country. And the next year, August 6, 1965, we got the Voting Rights Act. Not because Congress wanted to do it, not because the president called for it, but because the activists made them do it.
Well, thank you. I know they've called votes, but thank you all. And stay tuned for some more good trouble that the Democratic caucus will get into as we pursue passing the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.